At dinner, my sister laughed and said, "Don't ask her about her career. It's too embarrassing," and everyone smirked like I had nothing to say. I stayed calm, letting the silence stretch just long enough. Then her new boyfriend quietly looked at me and said, "So, should I tell them who signed my paycheck this morning?" In that instant, the room froze. My sister's face drained of color before anyone else understood. Because the truth about me was the last thing she wanted revealed. For 15 years, I watched my sister Natalie curate a life that felt like a series of trophies designed to make the rest of us look like participation ribbons. She was the golden child who never tarnished, the valedictorian who married a high-powered corporate lawyer named Bradley and spent over a decade perfecting the image of suburban royalty. I was the sister who took the risks, the one who chose sleepless nights in a cramped studio apartment over the safety of a predictable path. I remember the smell of cheap ramen and the cold glow of my monitor at 3 a.m. during the early days of Apex Solutions, the tech consulting firm I built from nothing. Those were the years when Natalie would call with a voice dripping in thinly veiled pity, asking if my little project was sustainable while reminding me that Bradley said most startups fail within 5 years. She didn't see the foundation I was pouring. She only saw a sister who wasn't measuring up to her polished standard of success. The first 3 years of Apex Solutions were a brutal lesson in persistence. I specialized in cybersecurity infrastructure for mid-size companies, a niche that many dismissed until they were hit with a data breach that threatened to bankrupt them. I fielded rejection after rejection from potential clients who looked at my age and assumed I was playing house in the tech world. Natalie was the loudest voice in that chorus of doubt, often steering family conversations away from my work as if my career were an embarrassing secret or a terminal illness we all had to be polite about. While she was busy renovating her massive home, joining exclusive country clubs, and ensuring her 2 children were enrolled in the most prestigious private schools, I was methodically hiring brilliant engineers who believed in a vision of a more secure digital world. We landed a manufacturing contract in Ohio, then a healthcare provider in Texas, and by year 5, the revenue finally started to feel real. By the time we hit our 8th year, Apex Solutions had expanded to 2 offices and was attracting the attention of major corporations. Natalie's calls became less frequent during this period of growth. Her own life was undergoing a seismic shift. Her marriage to Bradley had imploded after he left her for a paralegal at his firm. The divorce was finalized 8 months ago, and my mother recently called to tell me that Natalie had started dating again. Her new boyfriend was a man named Kevin who also worked in technology, which Mom seemed to think was a wonderful coincidence. A family dinner was scheduled for a Saturday evening in late September at our parents' house in Connecticut to introduce him. Mom had prepared a massive spread of roasted chicken, garlic mashed potatoes, and her famous apple pie, clearly hoping for a night of seamless family bonding. I arrived on time, dressed in a simple sweater and jeans, while Natalie showed up 15 minutes late with Kevin in tow. He was younger than Bradley, perhaps in his late 30s, with an easy smile and a confident handshake that felt genuine. As we settled around the dining table, the conversation was light and typical. Dad talked about his golf game, Mom updated us on her book club, and Natalie shared the latest achievements of her children. Kevin was polite and engaged, asking thoughtful questions and fitting in better than Bradley ever had. Then, Dad turned his attention to me and asked how business was going, mentioning a pharmaceutical contract I had brought up months ago. I opened my mouth to give him a brief update, but Natalie cut me off with a forced, sharp laugh that echoed through the room. "Don't ask her about her career, Dad," Natalie said, her voice carrying a patronizing edge that made the table fall silent. "It is just too embarrassing." The comment hung in the air like a physical weight. Mom's fork stopped halfway to her mouth, and Dad's brow furrowed in confusion. I felt a familiar heat rising in my chest, a mixture of frustration and the exhaustion of being underestimated for a decade. Kevin looked between us, his expression shifting from curiosity to bewilderment. Natalie waved her hand dismissively, as if she were shooing away a fly. She runs this little tech thing, and it is fine for her, but you know how those small businesses are. They are barely scraping by, always one bad quarter away from folding. I just don't want Dad to feel uncomfortable asking when we all know she is struggling. The arrogance in her voice was staggering. She hadn't asked a single question about my company in years, yet she had constructed an entire narrative where I was a failing entrepreneur living on the edge of ruin. She needed me to be struggling so that her own status remained unchallenged. Kevin's expression changed then. Something clicked behind his eyes as he set his wine glass down with deliberate care. He looked directly at me, ignoring the tension Natalie had just created. "What is your company called?" he asked quietly. I met his gaze and replied evenly that it was Apex Solutions. His eyebrows shot up, and a slow, knowing smile spread across his face as the realization hit him. "You are the CEO of Apex Solutions?" Kevin asked, his voice filled with a sudden, intense respect. I confirmed that I was, watching as Natalie's face began to lose its color. She looked between the two of us, her confusion turning into a growing sense of dread. Kevin didn't look at her. He was too focused on the fact that he was sitting across from someone he clearly admired in a professional capacity. "The keynote at the TechSecure conference in Boston back on March 15th, that was you, wasn't it?" he asked. I told him it was, and he shook his head in disbelief. He told the table that he had been in the front row and that my presentation on implementing layered security protocols for mid-tier companies was the best of the entire conference. He mentioned that people were still talking about it weeks later at networking receptions. Dad leaned forward, his interest piqued. "You gave a keynote address?" he asked, looking at me as if seeing me for the first time. Kevin took it a step further, his voice full of incredulity as he explained that I was one of the most sought-after speakers in the cybersecurity field. He told my parents that he had colleagues who had been trying to book me for company events for months, without success. Natalie's hand trembled as she reached for her water. She stammered that I had never mentioned any of this, but I corrected her quietly. I told her I had called her the week before that conference because I was nervous and wanted to talk it through with my sister. She had brushed me off, saying she had to meet a friend for lunch and would catch up later. We never did. The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable. Mom looked stricken, and Dad's jaw tightened as the reality of my success began to sink in. Kevin, seemingly unaware of the emotional bomb he had just detonated, continued to praise the work my company had done. He revealed that he worked for Morrison Industries, a massive manufacturing conglomerate, and that they had been trying to get a meeting with Apex Solutions for 2 years. They finally became clients 18 months ago, and he credited my team with transforming their entire operation. He explained how their previous system was a patchwork nightmare, and how the overhaul we designed had saved them from constant anxiety over potential breaches. Kevin was genuinely enthusiastic, describing the 300-page risk assessment my team had produced as the most comprehensive analysis they had ever seen. He was impressed that I asked if he had actually read it, noting that most clients only look at the executive summary. He had read every page twice. Natalie finally found her voice again, asking tentatively if he was saying my company was successful. Kevin looked at her with a softened expression, explaining that Apex Solutions wasn't just successful, we were industry leaders. He leaned back in his chair, amused, and asked if he should tell the family who had signed his paycheck. That morning, Natalie's face drained of all remaining color as Kevin explained that he was the director of IT operations at Morrison Industries. He told everyone that my company was the reason they hadn't suffered a catastrophic breach the previous fall, which would have cost them tens of millions of dollars. He laid out the facts for the table, Apex Solutions was one of the most respected firms in the Northeast, with 70 employees across 3 offices and annual revenue in the 8 figures. My mother repeated the phrase 8 figures faintly, her eyes wide. I had never shared our financials with them because it felt crass, and I honestly didn't think they cared. But seeing the shock on their faces, I decided to be transparent. I told them that last year's revenue was just over $12 million, and we were projected to hit $16.5 million this year. The clink of silverware stopped entirely. Natalie echoed the 12 million figure, her voice hollow and defeated. I clarified that it was revenue, not profit, noting that after overhead and reinvestment, my personal take-home was around $800,000 in salary and distributions last year. My father, stunned, asked if I had a patent, and I admitted I had too for a proprietary threat detection algorithm. Kevin jumped in to explain how that very algorithm had caught an attempted intrusion on their system, saving them from total compromise. He looked at me with genuine respect, stating that I had literally saved his company from a catastrophe. Natalie had been quiet, but now she asked why I had let them think I was struggling. The question sparked a heat in my chest. I told her that I had tried to tell them for years, but every time I mentioned a milestone, she would change the subject or call my business adorable. I reminded her of the previous Christmas when she patted my hand and treated my 65-employee company like a phase I would grow out of. Dad cleared his throat and admitted they owed me an apology and recognition for what I had accomplished without their support. I told him I didn't need their support because I had built it on my own, but it would have been nice to be seen for who I actually was. Natalie pushed her chair back and walked out to the porch for air, with Kevin following her, leaving me alone with my parents. Mom reached out, her eyes bright with tears, telling me how proud she was. I looked at her and asked if she really was or if she was just surprised. The words escaped my lips before I could think to restrain them, cutting through the heavy silence of the dining room. Are you proud of me now because you finally heard the numbers, or would you still be proud if I were earning $50,000 a year doing work I actually loved? My mother flinched as if I'd struck her, whispering that my question wasn't fair. But I couldn't stop. I pointed out that for over a decade, they had obsessed over my dating life and whether I was ready to settle down, yet never once asked what kept me passionate or how a single project had gone. My father rubbed his face with a weary hand, admitting they had become comfortable letting Natalie's narrative fill in the blanks. He confessed they were too lazy to dig deeper because she was always so confident in her assessments. I told him flatly that she was threatened by me, and instead of facing her own insecurities, she turned me into the family's cautionary tale, the daughter who chose the wrong path and was paying the price. Through the window, I watched Natalie and Kevin on the porch. Her arms were crossed defensively while he spoke with a patient but firm posture. Inside, my father admitted that dismissing my accomplishments ranked as one of his greatest failures as a parent. He confessed his limited understanding of technology created blind spots, leading him to ignore the empire I was building. My mother added that she'd read about the desperate need for cybersecurity expertise recently and wondered if I did that kind of work, but she never called. She claimed she didn't want to bother me, but I told them both the truth. I was never too busy for family, but I was exhausted from defending my life choices. For 10 years, they assumed I was failing because I wasn't following their specific playbook for success. When Natalie and Kevin finally returned to the table 15 minutes later, she looked like she had been crying. Her mascara was slightly smudged, and the arrogance that usually defined her was gone. She apologized stiffly, admitting her behavior was inappropriate and based on assumptions she had no right to make. When I asked her why she was so invested in my failure, her honesty caught me off guard. She confessed that if I succeeded by doing things my way, it meant her way wasn't the only right path. After Bradley left her, She needed to believe her traditional choices were superior to justify everything she had sacrificed. She admitted to Googling my company late at night, reading about my growth and seeing my success, only to close the browser and lie to herself that it was all smoke and mirrors. She looked at me with raw vulnerability, admitting she had made herself small to fit into Bradley's world and resented that I had refused to compromise myself for anyone. Kevin had been calling her out for weeks on her condescension, but it wasn't until she heard herself say my career was too embarrassing to discuss that the cruelty of her narrative truly hit her. She apologized deeply for making me feel ashamed of my incredible achievements. My father acknowledged that they had allowed Natalie's voice to dominate the family for too long without verifying the facts. Dinner resumed with apple pie, but the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. As Kevin and I began discussing the future of cybersecurity and industrial control systems, he asked for my card, eager to expand our professional relationship. The years of resentment were finally out in the open, and for the first time, my family was actually listening. Kevin eventually moved into the kitchen to help our father with the coffee, leaving a heavy but necessary silence between Natalie and me. She leaned toward me, her expression finally unreadable rather than judgmental. She asked if it was always like this for me, if people truly lit up when they found out what I did for a living. I told her the truth. In the world of cybersecurity, everyone is terrified of a breach, and when they find someone who can actually protect their data, they listen. Natalie absorbed this, admitting quietly that she had wasted so much time being jealous of a life she didn't even bother to understand. I told her it wasn't wasted if she learned from it, but the bruises from her years of dismissiveness still felt tender. She asked me to really tell her the story, not the abbreviated version I usually gave to avoid her condescension. So, I walked her through the early days, the cold calls from my studio apartment, the crushing rejections, and the first major contract that kept us afloat. I described the late nights debugging protocols and the sheer weight of responsibility I felt for the 70 people who now depended on Apex solutions for their livelihoods. When I admitted that some days the pressure felt crushing, but my stubbornness kept me going, she finally laughed. It was the first genuine moment of sisterhood we had shared in a decade. Over the next few months, our relationship underwent a radical transformation. Natalie started calling just to check in, asking real questions about my expansion into the Mid-Atlantic market or what kept me up at night. She even came by the office for a tour, her eyes widening as she watched our security operations center in real time. She met my team, including my CTO, and I watched her transition from polite interest to genuine fascination. She hugged me tightly on her way out, thanking me for finally letting her in. That spring, the journey reached a pinnacle I never could have imagined in that studio apartment. Apex Solutions was acquired by a massive technology firm. The deal allowed me to keep my role as CEO and full autonomy while giving us national resources. Natalie was the first person I called, and her breathless excitement was the validation I had once craved but no longer needed. At the acquisition party, my parents arrived from Connecticut, and my father pulled me into a hug, admitting they had let Natalie's skepticism cloud their judgment for far too long. I told him I forgave him, choosing to focus on the fact that they were finally standing there, proud and present. As the party wound down, Natalie found me on the balcony. She admitted that watching me bet on myself had inspired her to start her own consulting practice, helping divorced women with financial planning. She told me she was grateful I hadn't given up on her, even when she was insufferable. We stood there together, two sisters who had finally learned to exist without the poison of competition. My phone buzzed later that night with a text from her, "Lunch next week. I want to pick your brain about scaling my practice. Also, just want to hang out with my badass sister." For the first time in 15 years, the golden child and the risk taker were finally on the same team.